Welcome to Derm Drop. I'm your host, David Sider, bringing you quick picks from the dermatology literature and other sources in the dermatology community. Episode 17 includes 4 segments, starting with nanobodies. What role are they poised to play in dermatology? Followed by non-spontaneous urticaria. What rule-out should you keep on your radar? Then psoriasiform dermatitis. What is it and how to treat it? And finally, a new target in acne. Fatty acid synthase inhibitors in the pipeline. Fun stuff as always, so let's get started. What do llamas have to do with nanobodies and the future of dermatology? As part of the camelid family with camels and alpacas, llamas have antibodies without light chains. So the variable region of the heavy chain, the antigen binding part, has evolved to function alone. Use that part to target cytokines and you've got next generation mini antibodies. Of course, marketing had to get involved, and Abelinx, the Belgian biotech company that developed the first drug to use these stripped-down antibody fragments, coined the term nanobody. It's an apt moniker as these things are 1/10 the size of a normal antibody, which enables them to better penetrate inflamed skin and joint tissues. They're also easier to produce, which may lower costs, and they remain stable in a wider range of temperatures and pH. Abelinx's drug hit the EU market in 2018 for acquired thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura, and others have followed, including a PD-L1 inhibitor for solid tumors in 2021 and a TNF inhibitor for rheumatoid arthritis in 2022, with several more in the pipeline, including sonelokimab, an IL-17A/F blocker. Interestingly, sonelokimab's recent hidradenitis suppurativa phase 3 data drop received mixed reactions. The primary endpoint of HiSCR 75 was ambitious, with about 35% of pooled patients achieving it at week 12, but the placebo response rate in one arm was unusually high at over 25%, prompting one bearish commentator, who may not realize the disease naturally waxes and wanes, to call it disastrous, while the dermatology press has remained cautiously optimistic. The placebo response in the other arm was in the typical range at 17.5%, and the phase 2 results for psoriatic arthritis, published in the 6 October 2025 issue of Nature Medicine, were positive without caveat. But the real promise of nanobodies is the ability to combine them to create multivalent antibodies with more than one target. Imagine a TNF plus IL-17 blocker, for example, could be a game changer for hard-to-control diseases like hidradenitis suppurativa. Or how about an atopic dermatitis biologic that targets IL-13 and IL-31? So what are the downsides? Fortunately, potential drawbacks have already been mitigated or are not relevant to dermatology applications. For example, nanobodies have been humanized to achieve low immunogenicity, meaning neutralizing anti-drug antibodies won't dampen their long-term efficacy. By the way, we're getting affibodies too. These are synthetic antibody mimics derived from staphylococcal proteins and are about half the size of nanobodies, allowing even faster, deeper penetration into poorly perfused, chronically inflamed skin, with potential additional advantages in stability, manufacturing, and flexibility. Izokibep, the forerunner in this space, is an IL-17A inhibitor with positive phase 3 results announced at the EADV Congress in September 2025. At week 16, over one-third achieved HiSCR 75 and over 20% achieved HiSCR 100. So, thanks to llamas and staff, our derm future looks bright. Don't forget, not all chronic urticaria is spontaneous. With dupilumab, aka Dupixent, and now remibrutinib, aka Rapsido, getting FDA approvals for chronic spontaneous urticaria recently, what's gotten lost in the narrative is that CSU is a diagnosis of exclusion. That is, it's only spontaneous, previously idiopathic, if inducible causes and underlying disease have been ruled out. Of course, chronic inducible urticaria, or CINDU, is going to announce itself, as the patient will likely notice a pattern of onset after exposure to physical stimuli such as pressure, scratching, heat, cold, exercise, UV light, etc. So that leaves systemic or secondary causes for you to keep on your radar. Underlying conditions that cause chronic urticaria can range from infections, for example, H. pylori, hepatitis B and C, and parasites such as Giardia, malignancies, for example, lymphoma, mast cell disorders such as mastocytosis and mast cell activation syndromes, and autoimmune diseases such as systemic lupus erythematosus. And the authors of an article in the October 2025 issue of Current Opinion in Allergy and Clinical Immunology remind us that chronic urticaria can also be associated with autoinflammatory syndromes. There are many autoinflammatory syndromes, but the most common ones that can present in adulthood include Schnitzler syndrome, adult onset Still's disease, and Muckle-Wells syndrome, which typically presents by 20 years of age. While urticaria is often the presenting complaint in these syndromes, they comprise less than 1 to 2% of chronic urticaria cases. So, are you going to work up every patient that walks in with recurrent hives for autoinflammatory syndromes? No, you're going to do a quick review of systems. So, what are the high-yield questions? Non-pruritic, painful, burning wheals that last greater than 24 hours. Fevers, arthralgias, sore throat, and hearing loss. Family history might be helpful in some cases, but the ones you're most likely to see are not heritable. So your patient has hives with other unexplained symptoms. Now what? While some cases require a multidisciplinary team, your rheumatologist friend will be your typical go-to, and there's a good chance they'll treat them with an IL-1 inhibitor like anakinra, aka Kineret. And while they're waiting to get in, you could order some initial labs such as CBC, CMP, CRP or ESR, ferritin, autoantibodies such as ANA, rheumatoid factor, anti-TPO, etc., and complement such as C3 and C4. But you can save the nitty-gritty syndrome-specific workup like serum protein electrophoresis or SPEP for the specialists. If dermatology is taking on urticaria again, we need to be prepared for all comers. We don't want to be the reason a delay in diagnosis led to long-term sequelae such as amyloidosis. Plus, you can be the hero that diagnoses their rare disease and, more importantly, start them on the pathway toward improved health and quality of life. The dreaded Psoriasiform Dermatitis Path Report. What even is that? The authors of an analysis published in the August 2025 issue of the Journal of Investigative Dermatology described it as an intermediary phenotype with characteristics of psoriasis and atopic dermatitis that is likely Th22 driven. Okay, but you biopsied it to guide your selection of a targeted systemic therapy. So now what? Leo Pharma is working on an IL-22 receptor blocker for AD that might eventually provide an answer to that question. IL-22 is involved in wound repair, which requires migration and proliferation of keratinocytes, so when it's dysregulated, the skin gets hyperkeratinized. That's why IL-22 plays a prominent role in the epidermal changes seen in psoriasis plaques and the lichenification and barrier dysfunction of eczema. So why isn't Leo's IL-22 inhibitor temtocibart being investigated for psoriasis too? Well, because IL-22 is downstream from IL-23 and IL-17, so it gets inhibited when those cytokines are targeted. But in AD, targeting IL-4 or IL-13 can only dial down excess IL-22 indirectly by quieting the crosstalk, which recruits ancillary inflammatory cascades like Th22. Temtocibart, however, goes directly to the source of keratinocyte remodeling and epidermal hyperproliferation. But wouldn't that let Th2, the primary driver of AD, go unchecked? No, because the crosstalk goes both ways. And if the epidermal barrier is normalized, antigens can no longer penetrate and trigger Th2 inflammation. But with an increasing number of choices, where will an IL-22 inhibitor like temtocibart fit in? Certainly for the less inflammatory, more lichenified AD patients, those not that itchy, thick eczema patients, the IL-4/13 partial responders, the paradoxical drug-induced cases, the unfortunate mixed morphology dual AD/PSO souls, and yes, even those in between psoriasiform dermatitis cases. Despite the announcement of positive Phase 2b results for temtocibart at the recent EADV Congress in Paris, Apples-to-apples data is not yet available for comparison, as percent of patients achieving EASI-75 or IGA 0 or 1 was not provided. But there was about a 20% delta over placebo in EASI improvement at week 16. If temtocobart demonstrates late-stage and real-world efficacy in intermediary phenotypes, the dreaded path report will no longer be a therapeutic conundrum, as psoriasiform dermatitis will be a targetable entity. When was the last time you saw a new target in acne? Sagament Biosciences announced in June 2025 that its oral fatty acid synthase inhibitor denifanstat met all phase 3 primary and secondary endpoints versus placebo in an acne study carried out by its licensing partner Ascletis Pharma Incorporated in China. A pill that isn't an antibiotic, can be taken by men, and doesn't require iPledge in the US? Yes, please. As fatty acid synthase, or FASN, is the last step in lipogenesis, this novel mechanism of action turns down the overproduction of sebum and dampens the resulting inflammatory cascade, which is central to the pathogenesis of acne. So, quick recap. The triglycerides in sebum feed cutibacteria, which proliferate and produce irritating metabolic byproducts which trigger inflammation. The squalene in sebum gets oxidized by UV light, resulting in reactive oxygen species that trigger hyperkeratinization. And shed keratinocytes mix with the excess sebum to block follicles, trapping the triggers and exacerbating the inflammatory cycle. So targeting sebum production is key and has a proven track record in acne therapeutics, from isotretinoin to spironolactone, OCPs, and clascoterone, which have done the same thing via different mechanisms. So how effective was denifanstat compared to those treatments? While it's certainly no Accutane, the company's press release claimed it performs 60% better than clascoterone, aka Winlevi, in getting patients clear or almost clear. Compared to antibiotics using published data, denifanstat was almost twice as effective as sarecycline, aka Seysara, and approaching 3 times the efficacy of doxycycline. Even if you take such comparisons with a grain of salt due to differing populations, study designs, etc., as monotherapy, it looks like denifanstat can compete in the moderate to severe acne arena. And it appears quite tolerable. Only 2 treatment-emergent adverse events, or TEAEs, surpassed 5%. Dry skin was 6.3%, and dry eye at 5.9%, versus 2.9% and 3.8% in placebo-treated subjects, respectively. Adherence rates for a once-daily oral option are likely to be advantageous too, especially for those 15-year-old boys. Despite the promising results, Sagament plans to develop denifanstat for metabolic dysfunction-associated steatohepatitis, or MASH, outside of China, and is working on another FASN inhibitor currently in phase 1 for acne to market elsewhere. We can only speculate as to why Sagament has chosen to develop another FASN inhibitor rather than pursue an acne indication for denifanstat outside of China. It could be to comply with licensing restrictions, to avoid confusion or distractions from its potentially lucrative MASH indication, or to optimize a molecule for dermatology applications. Whatever the reason, fingers crossed the new FASN inhibitor will be even better. And that wraps up episode 17. Derm Drop is written and hosted by me, David Sider, with production, distribution, and promotion by Jacob Gary. Full text and links to the articles discussed in this episode can be found at linkedin.com/in/Dave-Sider, spelled SEITER. Questions and comments can be sent to us at dermdrop@gmail.com. If you had a good time and learned something useful, give us some love with a thumbs up, 5 stars, a comment, or review, and be sure to tell your colleagues. Thanks for listening, and tune in again in 2 weeks for more dermatology quick picks in the next episode of Derm Drop.